Was there ever a woman so dangerous that a man who built empires, who bent entire cities to his will, found himself powerless before her? The year was 1952. Manhattan gleamed under a blanket of fresh snow, the kind that muffled the roar of the city into something almost peaceful. Almost. On the 42nd floor of the Chrysler Building, Marcus Hale stood at a window, his reflection sharp against the glass. A man carved from ambition and cold calculation. At 38, he owned half the real estate in Lower Manhattan, had 3 senators in his pocket, and a reputation that made grown men stammer. When Marcus Hale wanted something, he took it. When he wanted someone gone, they vanished from the city's memory like smoke. But tonight, his hands trembled, just slightly, just enough. Because somewhere in the streets below, walking through that deceptive snow, was the only person who had ever looked him in the eye and said no, not just no. She had smiled when she said it, a smile that reached places in him he thought he'd buried beneath concrete and steel years ago. Her name was Evelyn Cross, and she was about to ruin him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Their first meeting happened 3 months earlier at a fundraiser he never wanted to attend. The Plaza Hotel's ballroom dripped with wealth, chandeliers like frozen waterfalls, champagne flowing like a prophet's promise. Marcus stood near the bar, bored, calculating which politicians he needed to speak with and which he could afford to ignore. That's when he saw her. She wore black. Simple, devastating black. But it wasn't the dress that stopped him mid-thought. It was the way she moved through the crowd like she owned something far more valuable than money. Confidence, yes, but something else too. Something that looked dangerously like freedom. He approached her the way he approached everything, direct, certain of the outcome. "Marcus Hale," he said, extending his hand. "I don't believe we've met." She glanced at his hand, then at his face, her green eyes holding an amusement that immediately irritated him. "I know who you are, Mr. Hale. Everyone here does. You're the man who owns New York." She didn't take his hand. Not all of it. Not yet. He smiled the smile that usually worked, the one that suggested infinite possibility and just a hint of danger. "And you are?" "Evelyn Cross. I'm the woman you can't buy." Most people, when they tried to play hard to get with Marcus, revealed their price within minutes. A job for a relative. A property dispute resolved. Everyone had a number, a weak spot, a secret dream they'd trade for the right offer. But as the evening wore on, as he maneuvered himself into conversations near her, as he watched her deflect the advances of senators and oil barons with the same bemused grace, he realized something unsettling. She meant it. Over the following weeks, Marcus did what he always did when he wanted something. He researched. Evelyn Cross, age 34, ran a small art gallery in Greenwich Village. Not successful enough to be notable, not failing enough to be desperate. She'd inherited it from a mentor, an artist who died penniless but beloved. She lived in a rent-controlled apartment she could have afforded to buy outright but chose not to. She had no debts, no scandals, no obvious vulnerabilities. She was, by every measure that mattered to Marcus, unremarkable. Except she wasn't. Because when he closed his eyes at night, lying in his penthouse surrounded by everything money could create, he saw her smile. That knowing, infuriating smile that suggested she saw through the marble and mahogany to something small and desperate underneath. He visited her gallery on a Tuesday afternoon. She was hanging a painting when he entered, standing on a ladder in a paint-stained shirt that probably cost less than his tie. She didn't turn around. "Mr. Hale, I wondered when you'd show up here." "You have quite a collection," he said, though he barely glanced at the canvases surrounding him. Abstract things that made no sense, all emotion and no structure. "I'd like to make you an offer. I'm sure you would." She descended the ladder with unhurried grace. "Let me guess. You want to buy the building, turn my gallery into luxury condos or some awful fusion restaurant?" Actually, I want to buy you dinner. For the first time since he'd met her, something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe. Or was it disappointment? Just dinner? Just dinner. No agenda, no deals. She studied him for a long moment, and he felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 decades. Uncertainty. Finally, she smiled. Not the knowing smile, but something softer, sadder. Okay, Mr. Hale. 1 dinner. But I'm choosing the place. She took him to a diner in Queens. An actual diner with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the war. Marcus, who hadn't eaten anywhere without a wine list in 15 years, found himself laughing at something she said about the art world's pretensions. Found himself talking about things he never discussed. The foster homes he'd clawed his way out of. The first building he'd bought with money he probably shouldn't have taken. The loneliness that came with building an empire, one calculated decision at a time. She listened, really listened. And when he finally asked her why she'd agreed to dinner, why she'd let him in after shutting him out so completely, she set down her coffee and looked at him with those green eyes that seemed to see too much. Because, Marcus, I wanted to see if there was a person underneath all that armor you wear. And there is. That's the problem. What problem? You're falling in love with me. And I'm going to have to break your heart. He laughed. Actually laughed. That's quite an assumption, Miss Cross. Is it? She wasn't smiling now. Go home, Marcus. Forget you met me. You'll be happier. But he didn't go home. He went back the next day, and the day after that. He bought paintings he didn't understand, and books of poetry she recommended, and slowly, inevitably, he fell. Not the way he'd acquired buildings or influence, not with strategy and leverage. He fell the way men fall in myths and tragedies, completely and without defense. 3 months after that first dinner, Evelyn called him at midnight. Her voice was strange, distant. I need to see you. Now? But he was already reaching for his coat. There's something you need to know, something I should have told you before any of this started. He drove through the snowy streets to her apartment, his heart doing something irregular behind his ribs. When she opened the door, her face was pale, her eyes red. On the table between them sat a folder, thick, official-looking. What is this? He asked. Your answer, the reason I told you no that first night, the reason I tried to warn you away. She pushed the folder toward him. My name isn't Evelyn Cross. Not really. I'm Evelyn Hayes. Does that name mean anything to you? The room tilted. Hayes. Thomas Hayes, the architect. The man whose designs Marcus had stolen 20 years ago, whose company he'd bankrupted, He was my father, she said softly, and you destroyed him. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the city in white, covering everything. But some stains, Marcus was beginning to realize, ran too deep to bury. The folder remained unopened between them like a loaded gun. Marcus couldn't move. Outside, a siren wailed somewhere in the distance, cutting through the muffled silence of the snow. Thomas Hayes. The name echoed in his memory like a ghost he'd thought he'd successfully exorcised. 20 years. Had it really been 20 years since he'd taken those architectural designs, filed them under his own company, and watched Hayes spiral into obscurity and debt? Evelyn stood with her back to him now, looking out the window at the skeletal trees in the courtyard below. Her reflection in the glass was fractured, distorted by old imperfections in the pane. He died 5 years ago, she said quietly. Liver failure. But really he died long before that. You just made it official. Marcus found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. I didn't know he had a daughter. You didn't care enough to know. She turned, and the look on her face wasn't anger. That would have been easier to bear. It was something worse. Disappointment, grief, recognition. He talked about you sometimes toward the end. When the alcohol made him honest, he said you reminded him of himself when he was young, hungry, brilliant, willing to do anything to escape whatever hell you came from. Evelyn. He almost admired you for it, can you imagine? The man whose life you stole, and he almost admired the cleverness of how you did it. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's what killed me the most, that he died still believing in the goodness of people, even people like you. Marcus opened the folder with hands that felt disconnected from his body. Inside were documents he recognized. Blueprints, patents, legal papers with his signature next to forged dates, and photographs. Thomas Hayes at a drafting table, young and vital, his eyes bright with the kind of passion that didn't survive in men like Marcus. Thomas Hayes, decades later, gray and hollow, standing outside a courtroom where he'd just lost everything, and one photograph that made Marcus's chest tighten. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8, sitting on her father's shoulders, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. "You were looking for me," Marcus said slowly, understanding crystallizing like ice in his veins. "This whole time, the gallery, the fundraiser, all of it, you orchestrated our meeting." "Yes." Evelyn's voice was steady now, almost clinical. "I spent 3 years finding you, studying you, learning every aspect of your life. Your routines, your weaknesses, your absolute certainty that you could have anything you wanted. And then I made myself visible in exactly the right way, at exactly the right moment, knowing men like you can't resist the one thing that doesn't immediately submit. So this was revenge." He should have felt angry, betrayed. Instead, he felt something closer to awe. She'd played him perfectly, and even now, knowing it was a game, he couldn't quite bring himself to hate her for it. It was supposed to be. She sat down heavily in the chair across from him, suddenly looking exhausted. "I was going to make you fall in love with me. I was going to let you believe, just for a moment, that you could have something real, something that wasn't built on power and manipulation. And then I was going to destroy you the way you destroyed him. Take your company, expose every illegal deal, every stolen idea, every body you buried on your way to the top. I had lawyers ready, journalists, evidence that would put you in prison for the rest of your life." Marcus waited. There was more. He could hear it in the way her voice had shifted, could see it in the way her hands trembled slightly in her lap. "But then something happened that I didn't plan for." She looked up at him, and her eyes were wet. "You weren't what I expected. You were supposed to be a monster, one-dimensional, easy to hate. Instead, you were—" She trailed off, searching for words. "You were broken in the same way my father was broken, hungry for something you couldn't name. You told me things in that diner, Marcus, real things, about being 8 years old and stealing bread because the foster home didn't feed you. About learning that the world only respects power because you watched kindness get beaten out of everyone you ever cared about. You showed me the person my father might have become if he'd made different choices. And I started to understand that revenge isn't clean. It's not simple. Because you're not simple." She stood and walked to a small desk in the corner, returning with another envelope. This one was sealed. "Inside here is everything. Every document, every recorded conversation, every piece of evidence I collected, enough to end you completely. I've been carrying it for 3 months, trying to decide what to do." She placed it on the table next to the first folder. "Tonight, I'm giving you a choice, a real one, not a manipulation." The radiator hissed in the corner, the only sound in the apartment besides their breathing. Snow continued to fall outside, and Marcus had the strange thought that the city had never looked so clean, so innocent, as it did from this small window in Queens. "What choice?" he asked. "You can walk away, right now. Leave New York, leave your empire, leave everything you've built on stolen dreams and broken people. Start over somewhere else. Be someone else. If you do that, these documents stay sealed. You get to keep your freedom, if not your kingdom." She paused, her next words coming slower. Or you can stay. You can face what you've done, not just to my father, but to everyone you've crushed on your way up. You can use everything you've built, all that power, all that influence, to actually fix some of the damage. Become the person you told me about in that diner, the one who remembers what it felt like to be powerless. And if I stay, what happens to us? There is no us, Marcus. There never really was. That's the price. You don't get redemption and the girl. You don't get to feel good about making better choices while still keeping the relationship you built on a foundation of lies. Her voice cracked slightly. You broke my father, and I broke you. We're even. But we're also done. Marcus stood, walked to the window, pressed his forehead against the cold glass. He could see his empire from here, the buildings stretching into the snowy sky like tombstones. He'd spent 20 years becoming untouchable, and in 3 months this woman had peeled away every defense until he stood here, raw and exposed, facing a choice no one had ever dared to give him before. You know what the terrible thing is? He said quietly. I think I really do love you. Not the version of you I thought I was falling for. The real you. The one who's smart enough and ruthless enough to trap me. The one who's brave enough to give me this choice instead of just destroying me. He turned to face her. You're more like me than your father ever was. I know, she whispered. That's why this has to end. Because I look at you and see what I could become if I'm not careful, someone who wins at everything and loses the only things that matter. He picked up the sealed envelope, felt its weight in his hands. Then he set it down and reached for his coat. At the door, he paused. I'll need some time to think about what you've offered. Take the time you need. But Marcus? He looked back at her, memorizing her face in the dim light. Whatever you choose, choose it because it's who you want to be. Not because of me, not because of him. The only person who can save you is yourself. He walked down the 5 flights of stairs instead of taking the elevator, needing the time to think, to breathe, to feel something other than the hollow ache spreading through his chest. When he emerged onto the street, the snow had stopped. The city gleamed under fresh powder, transformed, almost beautiful. His driver waited by the car, but Marcus waved him off. He needed to walk, to think, to understand what he was willing to sacrifice and what he couldn't bear to lose. Somewhere in the middle of the Brooklyn Bridge, the East River black and churning below, the skyline of Manhattan sharp against the pre-dawn sky, Marcus Hale made his decision. And when the sun rose 2 hours later, finding him still standing there, frozen in more ways than one, the man who had built an empire on ruthlessness finally understood what it meant to be truly powerless. Because Evelyn Cross had given him something no one else ever had. Not revenge, not love, but choice. And choice, he was beginning to realize, was the cruelest gift of all. The decision Marcus made on that bridge wasn't the one anyone would have expected, not even himself. He returned to his office as dawn broke over the city, the Chrysler Building's spire catching the first light like a spear. His secretary hadn't arrived yet. The floor was silent, tomb-like. He stood in his office doorway for a moment, seeing it as if for the first time. The mahogany desk, imported from Brazil. The leather chairs that cost more than most people earned in a year. The view that declared, louder than words ever could, that he had won. But won what exactly? He sat at his desk and opened his private files. Not the ones his lawyers knew about. The real ones, encrypted, hidden. The documentation of every calculated betrayal, every stolen idea, every person he'd systematically destroyed to build this monument to his own survival. Thomas Hayes was there, of course, but there were others, dozens of others. A small accounting firm that discovered irregularities in his first major deal, bought out and dissolved. A journalist who got too close to the truth about a property acquisition, career destroyed through carefully planted scandals. A former partner who wanted to go legitimate found himself bankrupt and blacklisted within 6 months. Marcus had always told himself these were necessary casualties. The cost of doing business, the price of winning in a city that ate the weak and rewarded the ruthless. But sitting there in the grey morning light, looking at the names and faces, he saw something else. He saw his foster father, the man who'd beaten him for stealing bread. He saw the social worker who'd looked at him with contempt, certain he'd end up in prison or dead. He saw every person who'd ever made him feel small and powerless. And he realized he'd spent 20 years becoming them. His phone rang, private line. Only 5 people had the number. He stared at it, debating, then answered. "I didn't expect to hear from you so soon." Evelyn's voice came through, careful, guarded. "I need to show you something," Marcus said. "Can you come to the office?" A pause. "Is this a trick?" "Maybe. I'm not sure anymore." He surprised himself with the honesty. "Please. I need you to see what I'm seeing." She arrived an hour later, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. She looked as exhausted as he felt, like neither of them had slept. He gestured to his computer screen, to the files he'd laid bare. "This is all of it," he said. "Every crime, every victim, 20 years of building an empire on other people's ruins." He turned to face her. "You were right about the choice being mine. But I need to understand something first. Your father. The documents in that folder. They prove I stole from him, but they also prove something else, don't they?" Evelyn's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or recognition that he'd seen through another layer of her carefully constructed trap. "The dates," Marcus continued. "The timestamps on some of those files, the photographs. Your father didn't just have one daughter, he had 2. You had a sister, Caroline. She would be, 30 now? Maybe 31? Evelyn sat down slowly in one of the expensive leather chairs. "You've been doing your homework. I spent all night doing what you spent 3 years doing, researching, following threads. And I found something interesting. Caroline Hayes died 7 years ago, overdose. She was 24. He pulled up another file on his screen. But before that, she worked for me. Junior analyst. Bright. Talented. I fired her after 6 months. Do you know why? Tell me." Evelyn's voice was cold now, all the vulnerability from the night before locked away behind steel. "Because she was stealing. Small amounts at first. Petty cash. Then she got bolder, started embezzling from client accounts. I didn't press charges, I just fired her. I thought I was being merciful." He closed his eyes. "I didn't know who she was. Didn't know she was Thomas Hayes' daughter. Didn't know her father had just died and she was spiraling. I just saw another problem to eliminate. She died 6 months after you fired her," Evelyn said quietly. "Homeless, addicted, alone. The overdose wasn't an accident, Marcus. It was a decision. She called me that night, asked me to come get her. I was in Paris working at a gallery trying to build a life away from my father's failures. I told her I'd come in the morning, that I had an important meeting I couldn't miss, an important meeting with an artist whose work might make my career." Her voice cracked. "She was dead by morning. And the meeting, the artist never showed up. It was nothing. It meant nothing. And she was gone." The office felt smaller suddenly, the view less triumphant. Marcus stood and walked to the window, needing distance, needing air. "So this isn't just about your father. It's about her too." "It's about all of us," Evelyn said. "Every person you've crushed without a second thought. Every life you've treated as collateral damage in your quest to never feel powerless again. My father, my sister, myself, who spent 3 years plotting revenge instead of grieving. We're all victims of the same disease, the belief that winning matters more than being human. She stood and joined him at the window. They stood side by side, looking out at the city that had shaped them both, that had taken two broken people and turned them into weapons pointed at each other. "I lied to you last night," she said, "about having a choice, about those documents staying sealed if you walked away. I was always going to destroy you, whether you left or stayed, whether you changed or didn't. Because I needed someone to pay for what happened to my family, and you were the closest thing to a villain I could find." Marcus absorbed this without surprise. Some part of him had known, had recognized the trap for what it was. "So, why are you telling me this now?" "Because I went home after you left, and I opened that sealed envelope, the one with all the evidence, and I started reading it again, really reading it, seeing it through your eyes instead of mine. And I realized something that terrified me." She turned to look at him directly. "Half of these documents, they don't just incriminate you, they incriminate me too." "What are you talking about?" "The gallery, Marcus. How do you think I kept it running all these years? It barely breaks even. My father left me nothing but debts. So where did the money come from?" She pulled out her phone, scrolled through files, showed him bank statements. "I've been laundering money for the Castellano family for 3 years. Art is perfect for it. Overvalue a painting. Create a fake sale. Clean money passes through as a legitimate business. I told myself it was survival, that I had no choice, that the world forced me into it. But the truth?" She laughed bitterly. "I became you, not to get close to you. That came later. I became you because it was easier than being honest, easier than admitting I was drowning." Marcus stared at the statements, at the careful documentation of crimes that mirrored his own. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I'm done with the performance. The righteous daughter seeking justice, the innocent victim. I'm not innocent. Maybe I never was. My father wasn't either, for that matter. Did you ever wonder why it was so easy to steal his designs? Why no one questioned it? I assumed he was careless. He was desperate. He'd gambled away most of his money, owed debts to people who break kneecaps for late payments. When you approached him about collaborating on those designs, he knew what you were really offering. A way out. He gave you those designs, Marcus. He let you steal them in exchange for enough money to pay off his debts and disappear from his creditors' radar." She sat back down, suddenly looking older. "He spent the rest of his life pretending to be the victim because it was easier than admitting he'd sold his soul. Just like I spent 3 years pretending my revenge was noble when really, I just wanted someone else to hurt as much as I hurt." The sun had fully risen now, flooding the office with harsh, honest light. Marcus felt something shifting inside him, some fundamental understanding of the story he'd been telling himself about his life. "So we're both frauds." "We're both human," Evelyn corrected. "Which is worse somehow. If you were just a monster, this would be simple. If I were just a victim, I could maintain my righteousness. But we're both just people who made bad choices because we were scared and hurt and didn't know how else to survive." Marcus returned to his desk, pulled out a bottle of whiskey he kept for important negotiations, poured 2 glasses. He handed one to Evelyn. "I'm going to tell you something no one knows. Not my lawyers, not my board. No one." She took the glass but didn't drink. Waited. 3 years ago I was diagnosed with a heart condition. Genetic. The doctor gave me maybe 5 years, 10 if I'm lucky and careful. I'm 38. I'll probably be dead before I'm 50. He drank, felt the burn, welcomed it. I've spent the last 3 years trying to figure out what it all means. Everything I've built, everyone I've destroyed. And I couldn't find an answer until last night when you gave me those envelopes, when you forced me to look at my life as if it were already over. And what did you see? Nothing. I saw nothing. No legacy that matters. No one who'll mourn me beyond the professional mourning of people who depend on my money. I saw a life spent winning a game that doesn't have a real prize. He set down his glass. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm gonna give you what you came for, not revenge, something better. He pulled out a folder from his desk drawer, fresh, prepared in the hours after he'd left her apartment. This is a complete transfer of ownership. Every asset, every company, every property. It all goes to a foundation in your name. You'll have full control. You can liquidate it all, give it to charity, use it to help the families of everyone I've destroyed. Or you can burn it all down just to watch it disappear. Your choice. Evelyn stared at the folder like it might bite her. This is insane. You can't just... I can. I am. The only condition is that you do it publicly. My name attached to every revelation, every crime exposed, every truth brought to light. I want everyone to know exactly what I did to build this empire. And then I want to watch you dismantle it piece by piece. Why? Her voice was barely a whisper now. Because you were right. The only person who can save me is myself. But I'm too far gone, Evelyn. I'm too broken. I've done too much damage. But you still have time. You can choose to be better than your father, better than me, better than the person you became in pursuit of revenge. You can take everything I built on pain and turn it into something that actually heals. Evelyn stood abruptly, backing away from the desk as if the folder were poison. No, this isn't how this works. You don't get to make yourself the martyr. You don't get to hand me your sins and call it redemption. I'm not looking for redemption, Marcus said quietly. I'm looking for an ending that means something, and I think you are too. Outside, the city roared to life. Morning traffic, voices, the eternal churn of millions of people trying to survive another day. Inside this office, two people stood in silence, the weight of all their choices hanging between them like smoke that refused to clear. Finally, Evelyn spoke. There's something else in my envelope, something I didn't tell you about. She pulled a single photograph from her purse, placed it on the desk between them. Do you recognize this? Marcus looked at the photo, a young woman, maybe 23, standing outside a hospital. She had Evelyn's eyes. Caroline. But something about the image nagged at him. Look at the date stamp, Evelyn said. This was taken the day before she died. Look at what she's holding. He looked closer. A folder. A folder he recognized because he'd seen it before. In his own files, marked with his company's logo. And suddenly, horribly, Marcus understood. Caroline hadn't just worked for him. She'd discovered something. And what she'd discovered had killed her. Marcus picked up the photograph with hands that had suddenly forgotten how to be steady. The folder Caroline held in the image bore his company's logo. But more than that, he could see now what he'd missed before. The expression on her face. Not the hollow desperation of addiction. Something sharper, clearer. The look of someone who'd found something they weren't supposed to find. She was going to expose you, Evelyn said softly. Not for revenge. She didn't even know you'd destroyed our father until after she started working for you. She stumbled onto it by accident, found discrepancies in old files while doing routine analysis, started pulling threads, and the more she pulled, the more she discovered. Not just about my father, about everything. Marcus sat down heavily. The whiskey glass felt like a foreign object in his hand. The embezzling. You said she was stealing from client accounts. She wasn't stealing. She was documenting. Creating a paper trail that would lead investigators to the real crimes buried beneath the surface. She was building a case. Evelyn's voice carried no accusation now, just exhaustion. When you fired her, she lost access to the files, lost her evidence, lost her purpose. That's when everything fell apart. She wasn't spiraling because she was weak. She was spiraling because she'd glimpsed the truth and then had it ripped away, leaving her alone with the knowledge that monsters like you always win. The office felt different now. The morning light that had seemed harsh and honest moments ago now felt clinical, exposing. Marcus could see dust motes floating in the air, each one suspended in its own small tragedy. "How long have you known this?" I found her notes 6 months before I ever came to that fundraiser. Found them in a storage unit I'd been paying for without knowing what was in it. She'd left everything there. Copies of documents, recordings, photographs. A journal where she wrote about you. About how she'd started by hating you and ended up seeing you as just another broken person, trapped in a system that rewards cruelty and punishes conscience. Evelyn moved to the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. She wrote that she didn't want to destroy you. She wanted to save you. Can you imagine? The girl whose family you'd ruined. And she thought you were worth saving. Marcus stood and walked to the safe behind his desk, the one no one else knew the combination to. Inside were documents he'd never shown anyone. Medical records, letters he'd written but never sent. And something else. A file he'd kept for 7 years, the contents of which had haunted him in ways he'd never fully understood until this moment. "After I fired Caroline, I had someone follow her," he said quietly. "Standard procedure. I do it with everyone who leaves under questionable circumstances. Make sure they're not going to become a problem." He pulled out the file, handed it to Evelyn. She went to 3 different news organizations. None of them would touch the story. Too risky, I was too powerful, and she was just a junkie with no credibility. She tried going to the police. They laughed her out of the station. She tried everything, Evelyn. She died trying to make someone listen. Evelyn opened the file, and Marcus watched her face as she read the private investigator's reports. Watched her see her sister's final weeks through the cold, clinical documentation of someone paid to observe, but never intervene. There were photographs. Caroline outside newspaper offices, looking diminished and desperate. Caroline sleeping on a bench in Central Park. Caroline staring at the East River, her face carrying the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting a battle you know you've already lost. "There's one more thing," Marcus said. "The night she died. The investigator was watching her. He called me, told me she was in bad shape, maybe suicidal, asked if he should intervene, and I said no. I said to just keep watching. Document everything but don't engage. I thought if she hit bottom she'd give up and disappear. I didn't think she'd..." His voice broke. "I didn't think she'd actually do it." Evelyn closed the file carefully, as if it were made of something more fragile than paper. When she looked up at him, her eyes were dry, but something in them had changed. The anger that had sustained her for 3 years was gone, replaced by something more complicated. "You could have saved her." "Yes." "You chose not to." "Yes." "Why are you telling me this now? Why not just let me believe it was an accident? Let me keep my narrative intact?" Marcus moved back to his desk, looked at the folder he'd prepared, the one that would transfer everything he'd built to her control. "Because your sister was right. I'm not a monster. I'm something worse. I'm a person who knows better but does evil anyway because it's convenient. Because it protects me. Because somewhere along the way, I decided that my survival mattered more than anyone else's humanity." He picked up the folder, held it out to her. "This isn't redemption. This isn't me trying to make things right. You can't make something like this right. This is me finally answering the question she asked in her journal. The one I had my investigator photograph because even then, some part of me knew it mattered." Evelyn took the file but didn't open it. "What question?" "If you could go back to the moment before you became someone you can't live with, would you? Or are we all just trapped in the stories we tell ourselves about why we had no choice?" Marcus smiled sadly. She was 24 years old and already wiser than I'll ever be. The silence that followed felt different from the others. Not empty, but full. Pregnant with all the words that couldn't be said. All the damage that couldn't be undone. All the lives that had collided and shattered and somehow led to this moment. "I can't forgive you." Evelyn said finally. "I won't. Not for my father, not for Caroline, not for any of it." "I know. But I think she would have. My sister. She had this ability to see people as they could be rather than as they were. It infuriated me when we were young. I thought it made her weak." She opened the folder Marcus had given her, scanned the documents inside. "You're really giving me everything. Everything. And you want me to expose it all. Every crime, every victim. Let the world see exactly what you are, Lee." "What I was," Marcus corrected. "What I am now, I'm not sure yet. Maybe that's something I get to figure out in whatever time I have left." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, looking between the folder in her hands and the man standing before her. Then she did something unexpected. She opened her purse and pulled out the sealed envelope from the night before, the one with all her evidence, all her carefully constructed proof of his crimes. She placed it on the desk next to the folder he'd given her. "I'm not going to use either of these," she said. Marcus stared at her. "What?" "I'm not going to destroy you, Marcus. I'm not going to save you either. I'm going to do something my sister tried to do and I was too angry to understand. I'm going to give you the same choice you gave me. The real one. The one that actually costs something." She picked up both the folder and the envelope, held them together. "You keep your company, you keep your power, but you use it differently. You find the people you've destroyed, and you help them. Not with money. Money is easy. You help them with the same systematic precision you use to destroy them. You rebuild what you broke. That could take years, decades. I don't have. You have whatever time you have. Use it, and I'll be watching. Not as your enemy, not as your lover, as something else. A witness. Someone who knows what you've done and will hold you accountable for what you do next. That's the real punishment, Marcus. Not prison. Not exposure. Having to live with yourself while trying to become someone worth living with." Marcus looked at the documents in her hands, at the power she was choosing not to wield. "Why?" "Because Caroline's last journal entry wasn't about you. It was about me. About how she hoped I wouldn't spend my life chasing revenge. About how she hoped I'd learn that the opposite of destruction isn't revenge. It's creation. Building something that matters more than the pain that came before." Evelyn's voice softened. "I've spent 3 years destroying myself in pursuit of destroying you. I think it's time we both tried something different." She walked to the door, paused with her hand on the handle. "I'm keeping the evidence. Both sets. If you fail, if you fall back into who you were, I'll use them. But if you actually do this, if you actually try to be better, then maybe when you're gone, people will remember you as the man who spent his last years trying to heal what he'd broken. That's not redemption, but it's something." After she left, Marcus stood alone in his office as the city hummed with life beyond his windows. He thought about Thomas Hayes, who'd sold his soul and then spent his life pretending to be a victim. He thought about Caroline, who'd seen the truth and died trying to speak it. He thought about Evelyn, who'd almost destroyed herself seeking revenge and chose mercy instead. And he thought about the question Caroline had written in her journal, about whether we're all just trapped in the stories we tell ourselves about why we had no choice. He picked up his phone and called his secretary. "Cancel everything for the next month and get me the files on every person or company we've acquired in the last 20 years. All of them. I need to make some calls." It was a beginning. Small, insufficient. 20 years of damage couldn't be erased in whatever time remained. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was simply choosing to try. To stop hiding behind the story of the boy who had to become a monster to survive and start writing a different story. The story of the man who looked at what he'd become and decided to spend his remaining days becoming someone else. The woman who'd told him no hadn't destroyed him. She'd given him something far more dangerous and precious. She'd given him a mirror and the courage to look into it, to see not just the monster or the victim, But the human being who'd spent so long trapped between the two that he'd forgotten there were other options. Marcus Hale stood at his window and watched the city wake fully to the day. Somewhere out there, Evelyn Cross was walking away from the revenge that had consumed her. Somewhere out there were dozens of people whose lives he'd ruined, who deserved more than apologies or money. Somewhere out there was the possibility that the last chapter of his story could be different from all the chapters before. It wouldn't be enough. It would never be enough. But it would be honest, and maybe, just maybe, that was the only redemption that mattered. Not the grand gesture or the dramatic reversal, just the quiet, daily choice to be slightly better than the person you were yesterday. To look at the damage you've done and spend whatever time you have left trying to build something in its place. The question Caroline had written still echoed in his mind. Are we all just trapped in the stories we tell ourselves? Maybe. But maybe we also get to choose which stories we keep telling and which ones we finally put down. Maybe freedom isn't escaping the past, but facing it honestly and then deciding, one small choice at a time, what happens next. In the end, the woman who told him no didn't own his soul. She'd simply shown him that he'd never lost it in the first place. He'd just buried it so deep beneath fear and ambition and the desperate need to never feel powerless again that he'd forgotten it was still there. Still capable of choice. Still capable of change. Still human, with everything terrible and beautiful that word contains. And that, Marcus realized as he finally turned away from the window and toward the work ahead, was both the curse and the gift of being alive. We are never just our worst moments. We are also every moment after, and every choice we make about who to become in the wake of understanding what we've been. The city sparkled in the morning light, indifferent to his revelation, indifferent to every human drama playing out in its millions of rooms and streets and secret spaces. But Marcus Hale, for perhaps the first time in 20 years, felt something other than the need to conquer it. He felt the weight of responsibility, the burden of consciousness, and beneath it all, something that might have been hope.